Before this video starts, I feel it's important to say that this is all a thought experiment. I don't really believe the theory that this video is going to be about, and I plan on discussing both the positives and the negatives of the theory all in this video, but I think there's definitely something here that's worth investigating, which is why I wanted to. The Survival Logbook might just be the most lore-heavy book in all of FNAF, with lore reveals like Cassidy being Golden Freddy, Michael Afton being the FNAF 4 protagonist, and the entire conversation between Cassidy and the bite victim. But with the recent release of Secret of the Mimic, I've sort of been rethinking the logbook, so I decided to go back through it and look at all the evidence, and today I'm going to share with you what I found, so let's get started. The Survival Logbook has faded text throughout, that of one spirit talking to another. On many of the pages with faded text, there's some number out of place. Plugging those numbers into the book's word search gives you the name Cassidy. Given these numbers are all on the pages the faded text speaks, and given the faded text writes my name all over the place, including on a grave drawn by Mike, it's clear that the name Cassidy belongs to the faded text and is also the child whose grave is hidden in the Lorekeeper ending of FNAF 6. There's also alter text in the book, and the faded spirit says two things that best indicate who they are. First, one of the questions asked by the faded text is, does he still talk to you? The question is asked on a page asking about stuffed animals and childhood imaginary friends, and the bottom left of the page shows an image of FNAF 4's Fredbear plushie. On another page, you are asked to plan a party, and the faded text writes, the party was for you, to which the altered text responds, it was for me. So this heavily implies that the bite victim is the altered text. This has been the primary belief ever since the logbook came out, or at least after people latched back onto Michael being the Foxy Bro. However, what if after all this time, we've been wrong about that? What if, in actuality, the altered text was David? Now, that's a pretty bold way to start the video, and you're probably tempted to click off right now because why would that ever be the case? Especially since David didn't exist when the logbook came out, and would have no reason to even be in the logbook. But like I said at the start of the video, I'm not saying I believe this. What I'm saying is that there's reason to believe this might just be possible. Just because at the time we didn't know the story of the Mimic, doesn't mean he didn't exist back then. A character existing is different from us knowing their name or their backstory. Obviously, William Afton existed in FNAF 1, but we knew essentially nothing about him, including his name. Edwin has clearly existed in the plot for a while, or at least some character must have existed to fill his role before he was fully fleshed out. These characters always existed to some capacity, but they went unnamed, and we didn't know their full stories until recently. So just because we didn't know the story of David at the time of the logbook, or even his name, doesn't mean he didn't exist. Plus, the logbook was made in part to solve the name Cassidy, and as it turns out, if David actually was the altered text, then his name actually could have been known by then. It was revealed within the book itself. See, the altered text responds to 4 different things in the book, all within the pre-Night 4 and 5 reflections, but the challenge is figuring out which message is responding to which. We have, I can hear sounds, it was for me, I can't see, and I'm scared. 4 in total. I can hear sounds either works for does he still talk to you or is this song familiar to you, but I think the latter makes less sense. It was for me is a response to the party was for you, and I can't see is obviously a response to what do you see. The last one, I'm scared, is a bit harder to come by, but the question do you have dreams on a page with Nightmare Fredbear makes sense to be the prompt since it's a nightmare character intentionally made to be scary. If we take all the page numbers of the faded messages that the altered text is responding to, then place them into the Foxy grid, we get the letters E, V, A, D. This is where the Evan code originated from, but because the N was found in a flawed way, it's not very likely accurate. Throughout the book, there's also a constant theme of reflection. Night 1 has a page dedicated to reflecting on things that you are most thankful for in life. The page with Nightmare Fredbear talks about reflecting on the meaning of your dreams. The page with the message, what do you see, has a mirror on it where you are supposed to draw your reflection. So if we take the book's advice, we can reverse the letters and we get D-A-V-E, Dave. Outside of being the name that Afton uses in both the books and probably FNAF 2, this is most likely the name of the altered text, and it just so happens to be the short form of the name David. Many people take this to mean that the bite victim's name is David, but what if that's not the case? What if David, Edwin's son, actually is the altered text? What a lot of people seem to forget about FNAF 4 is that the nightmare bedroom is not a real bedroom. See, we know that the player of FNAF 4 is Michael, as we see him draw Nightmare Fredbear in the logbook, and we also hear the FNAF 1 phone call. However, we also know from DittoPhobia that the nightmares are real mannequins amplified by hallucinogenic gas. What Michael goes through is a nightmare, but he's having dreams about these real events. In Sister Location's private room, typing 1983 into the keypad shows off the nightmare rooms. Right next to the monitor is the Bite Victim's Fredbear plushie, holding a controller with a speaker and 16 different buttons. In FNAF 4, the Fredbear plush speaks to the Bite Victim, who can explore 16 different areas on the map. What this implies is that the Fredbear plushie was meant to spy on the Bite Victim. 16 Fredbear plushies were set up throughout the FNAF 4 minigame map in each of the areas we can enter, and Afton was speaking to him through it. Having this plushie, holding a camera controller, next to monitors that show cameras of the FNAF 4 bedroom, implies that the Bite Victim was once in that bedroom, and that he did go through the nightmare experiments just like Rory from DittoPhobia did. However, what we need to keep in mind is that this nightmare bedroom is not the Bite Victim's bedroom. As I discussed in my last theory, the original bedroom, the one the FNAF 4 bedroom is based on, is actually David's bedroom, as we see in Secret of the Mimic. The plastic purple telephone isn't in David's room, but it is a collectible in the game, implying it belonged to David. Some people believe the Bite Victim never went through the nightmares in the first place, but whether that's true or if what I said was true, that phone toy did not belong to him. It belonged to David. But why is this important? Well, in the logbook, the faded text asks, "Was your favorite childhood toy a plastic purple telephone?" In addition, the faded text asks the questions, "Do any of these toys look familiar to you?" And, "Did one of these belong to you?" And on that page is an image of a toy phone. That plastic phone toy did not belong to the Bite Victim, it belonged to David. So if the Bite Victim was the altered text, those questions wouldn't make sense. As I said, while the Bite Victim should theoretically come into contact with that toy, it doesn't belong to him. He only would have seen it during the experiments, which likely wasn't for very long. And even if he liked the toy when he was in there, once he got out, he would have been extremely traumatized by the experience, as seen with his immense fear of Fredbear. He would have then associated that toy with the experience, and it very clearly would not be his favorite childhood toy. And like I said, it never even belonged to him, as the faded text indicates. There's a few other lines from the faded text that also line up pretty well with David, like, "Is this song familiar to you?" Since there's one song that constantly plays throughout the costume manor, the one that plays from the distraction buttons, so it could be referring to that. Or, "Do you miss them?" which could easily be referring to his parents. And most of all, the line, "The party was for you," which people also so heavily associate with the Bite Victim, but it actually works just as well for David. We learn in the logs and the final reel from the parachute ending that Edwin was throwing a party in the costume manor for David's 5th birthday. We can also find the room in which the party was being thrown in the Party Time Chica section of the game, locked behind a code. However, the party ended up being cancelled because David actually died on his 5th birthday before the party started. So, the line, "The party was for you," works just as well for him as, like the Bite Victim, he died on his birthday. So does that settle it? Were we wrong about the logbook? Well, not necessarily. See, on the surface, for the reasons I listed, there's a decent amount suggesting David to be the altered text instead of the Bite Victim. But on the flip side, there's a few reasons why that doesn't work at all. First of all, it just doesn't make much sense. There's really no reason that David would be important in this situation. While he definitely could have existed at the time, the logbook is all about Cassidy, confirming that she is Golden Freddy. David doesn't really have any specific role that would be valuable to learn about within this book alongside Cassidy, unlike the Bite Victim. If he is to be the altered text, the book provides no real insight into David's role in the series other than his mere existence, and that's if he even has a role outside of being Edwin's motivation. On top of that, the book doesn't suggest anything to do with Edwin himself, so David's inclusion here in this book would be futile. On top of that, while there are a lot of faded messages that do make sense for David, there's a couple that don't at all. For one, the question, does he still talk to you, doesn't make much sense for David in general. The mimic doesn't talk outside of when he mimics voices, and when David was alive, he only really ever mimicked Fiona, in which case the question should be, does she still talk to you? If we're talking about Tiger, that would be kinda weird because there's never any indication that David and Tiger communicate. It's possible that the game's version of Edwin had his voice built into Tiger, like what Henry does with Theodore in the novel trilogy, but that would be weird given there's no real indication of that. Possible, but unlikely. But regardless of that, the very same page shows the Fredbear plushie, very strongly indicating that that is the he the faded text is talking about. Technically speaking, it could be a reference to FNAF 4 while talking about something else entirely, but that's not very satisfying. And like I said, because there's no one the line makes sense for in association with David, also just having to ignore what's on the page seems like kind of a cop-out. But lastly, the David code itself. The D in the code is found by tracking I'm scared back to do you have dreams in relation to the nightmares. However, David Murray should, theoretically, never go through those nightmares, so it doesn't make much sense. So, someone named David went through the nightmares, but not David Murray? If the alter text isn't David, obviously it must be the bite victim, but if that's the case, then does Afton just also name his son David? It feels weird for Edwin and Afton to coincidentally name their sons David, unless the bite victim was born after David Murray died and Afton just named his son after Edwin's. But if that's the case, the phone toy connection still doesn't make sense, because it was still never the bite victim's toy. It feels like David Murray has to be the one in the logbook in order for the phone toy to make sense. You could maybe say that there's 3 different spirits in the book, but the conversation seems to be between the faded text and the alter text. Sure, the alter text doesn't respond to some questions, so maybe the faded text only asks altered, the bite victim, some of the questions, and the ones it doesn't are the ones that David has asked. The problem is that there aren't any responses to those questions, so there's really no indication that another spirit is here. Plus, the party was for you is responded to by the altered text, so if David is a 3rd spirit, the evidence of him also dying on his birthday is useless anyway. Hey guys, Evan in editing here. I'm actually sick right now, so that's why I sound different. One other thing is that the Dave code is also from the altered text, so if there was a 3rd spirit in the logbook, that wouldn't work, because then he and the altered text would have to be separate, which they don't seem to be. So this brings me to the final idea. Is David somehow the bite victim? It would allow the alter text to be both David and the bite victim, explaining the alter text association with the Fredbear plush and the phone toy, and explaining why the name David belongs to the alter text. But how would that work? After all, David is Edwin's son, not Afton, so is the bite victim a robot? As I talked about in the last video, a login secret of the Mimic reveals that Edwin's property is owned by Fazbear Entertainment and by extension Afton. Once Edwin dies, Afton most likely seizes Edwin's property. Now, many people believe that the secret ending isn't the canon one due to the fact that the Mimic is changed back into David during it, but what if it actually is the canon ending? See, that allows the Mimic to be in his David form and remain in his bedroom where he can be found by Afton. Maybe Afton then adopts him, transforming him into the bite victim, who is just an altered version of the Mimic with his David personality. Another option could just be that Afton builds a robot version of David who he raises as his own son, that robot being the bite victim. But there are a few issues here too. First, it's kind of boring. I feel like if the bite victim was a robot all the way back in FNAF 4, even before the bite of 83, there would have been some indication of it, but there never has been. But more importantly, there's a few aspects of the bite victim that don't really add up if he's a robot. For one, I mentioned earlier that it's most likely the bite victim went through the FNAF 4 nightmares as an experiment victim, yet we know the experiments were performed using the hallucinogenic gas, which would require the bite victim to be human in order to work. On top of that, he has a flatline at the end of FNAF 4. However, at the same time, Charlie is a very advanced robot in the books. Illusion discs work on her, and they work by overwhelming the brain, despite Charlie not having a real brain. So maybe the gas would work on such a robot. On top of that, Charlie is able to eat real food, meaning at least some of her artificial organs must work to some extent, so having a flatline isn't completely illogical. So it's not impossible, it just feels a little weird. However, there's also the question of what happens to the bite victim, because if his spirit possesses something, it would have to have done so when David originally died, because the robot theoretically wouldn't have his actual spirit, as with Charlie it never did. And that also brings us to the even bigger problem. If David was a robot, and the spirit wasn't wasn't in the robot, then how could the spirit be recalling things that happened to the robot? However, David being a robot is not the only way to work around him also being the bite victim. As I mentioned earlier, maybe David just never actually died, instead just being kidnapped by William Afton. Maybe he did so to intentionally hurt Edwin so he'd be behind on his projects and so his greedy ass could take more control of MCM, like how he said he took the house because Edwin was behind on his projects. So Afton takes Edwin's son and he decides to raise him as his own, and to prevent him from running away, maybe that's why he puts him through the nightmares. If the bite victim is the Midnight Motorist runaway, it might also explain what that place is in Midnight Motorist. Maybe it's MCM itself. It would also make a decent amount of sense since David got hit by a car in the books, yet in the games he died when he was out on his slide, which is nowhere near the road. It's possible he just ran to the road, but it would make sense if he was kidnapped. This all solves problems, but like anything, it also creates them. David dies on his 5th birthday, and this game takes place in 1979. However, there are a lot of events that need to happen between his death and this game, such as the construction of all the different failed M2 bodies, F10 and 4, the downfall of MCM, and seemingly 12 different teams sent in by Fazbear to try and fail to retrieve the Mimic. That requires at least a couple years, so if David did end up surviving, he would probably be too old to be the bite victim by that point. Even if David died in 1979, he'd be 9 by 1983, yet Curse of Dreadbear, which has heavy connections with the bite victim, has a birthday cake with 7 candles on it, implying the bite victim died on his 7th birthday, so David would be too old even at the latest his death could possibly be. If you're to say that the cake in Dreadbear doesn't display the bite victim's age, 9 is a reasonable age for him, but like I said, there were probably at least a few more years between, so by the time of 83, David would either be or almost be a teenager, which seems a little too old for the bite victim if you ask me. I also think it would be really weird story-wise for David to have just survived. I find it really hard to believe if David simply went missing rather than actually being confirmed dead, that Edwin would instantly just give up searching for him and just try to make M2 to replace him that quickly. You could make a case that Henry might have done the same thing in the books, but the difference is that Henry didn't do it on purpose. He simply poured all his grief and mental anguish in the loss of Charlie into the doll he made for her, which inadvertently caused it to start acting like her. Edwin literally made M2 to replace his lost child, and if he wasn't sure he was dead, that would be really weird. I can get behind David not running away from Afton considering the nightmares and the Fredbear plush being made to watch over him, but I think people from Fazbear Entertainment also probably would have recognized David as the child of Edwin Murray, who died. Overall, this is a very interesting theory and a fun thought experiment, but also a really messy one. Some things can work really well, but other things really don't. I think the main problem is that while you can kind of make some things work, it doesn't work in a very satisfying way, and it takes a lot of stretching. You really need to try to make it work, and when you have to try really hard to make a theory work, that might be a sign that it just doesn't work. Otherwise, the truth probably would have been made clearer, or at least the ways for them to work would have at least been indicated rather than just being things that we need to make up in order to get them to work properly. I like the idea overall, but I don't think it works very well, but maybe there is a way. I'm not really sure, but if you guys have any ideas, let me know in the comments. Until I hear a solid idea, I'm not going to definitively change my mind on any of this, but I do want to keep an open mind because the name Dave appearing in the logbook really makes me curious. But that's everything I wanted to talk about in this video. I hope you guys enjoyed. If you did, make sure to leave a like and subscribe if you want to, and I will see you all in the next video. Bye guys!